Fort Dix, New Jersey, was even colder than Chicago. We were in our dress uniforms, which the army took back. As I recall, they gave us summer khaki uniforms to wear. We may have had our regular utilities for a while also. It was a matter of standing out in the cold in formation day after day and waiting for our name to be called. Sergeants then walked by and gave out duties to be done by the guys in formation that were not called for their flight to Vietnam. Some of us just stayed in the warm barracks and listened for our names to be called, as we could hear the loudspeaker from inside the barracks. I heard my last name called and ran out into the formation. I found out that another guy had the last name of Gaynor, and it was he who they called. I still wonder if he made it out of Vietnam alive. There were buses leaving for the weekend so that some of us could go see New York City. Some guys were saying last chance to desert, as the gates were always guarded. I was from Chicago. New York City at 0 degrees Fahrenheit was the last place I wanted to see. Miami Beach was my style. Eventually my name was called after about 2 weeks, and I found myself on a passenger jet with 160 soldiers in my khaki uniform. We all had summer dress uniforms on. We landed about 5 hours later at a California air base. I think Travis Air Force Base. We had to stay in our seats as the jet was getting refueled. We took off again, and in about 6 hours we landed at Honolulu, Hawaii Airport. We were allowed to get off the plane and be in the terminal. I and some more guys went up to some high lookout tower with no windows and looked over the area. It was night and the air was so fresh and warm, and the plant smell was flowery and tropical. A few of us decided that if we made it out of the army alive, we would want to live in Hawaii for sure. It took me a long time, but at 74 years old, I have been living in Hawaii for 11 years. It's beautiful here. There were a lot of civilians in the terminal also. It would be a while before we would see civilians living in a peaceful place for a while. It was back on the plane after about an hour, and we were back up in the air. Next stop would be Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. The plane ride was very tiresome altogether. First 5 hours, then 6 hours, now about 8 hours, and we are still not in Vietnam. And we are flying on a fast jet. Most of us had books to read, a good way to pass the time. Better than thinking about where we are heading to or family back home. We landed in the Philippines in the daylight. We had to get off the plane on the runway and walk about 1 mile to a bivouac area that was shaded. The heat was almost unbearable. A few guys passed out on the walk on the runway in the blazing sun and had to be picked up by the ambulances. We went from 0 degrees Fahrenheit at Fort Dix to 104 in the humid Philippines. It was difficult for some of us to catch our breath. We hung around there until the plane was refueled again and walked back to the plane. How are we even going to function if it's going to be this hot in Vietnam, we thought.
Once we took off with next stop, Vietnam guys started to talk some. It really comes down to this. All the training we had guys on the plane that were trained in all sorts of things, and this is where they will put their training into practice. None of us had no real idea what Vietnam was going to be like. We had no idea what war was like. We were new guys just out of high school, headed for the big time, bigger than any baseball or football game. Little did I know at the time, but war was a deadly game of life and death. In the clash, some would live and others would die. It was a game of keeps. The pilot announced that we were approaching the coast of Vietnam. We all looked at the coast coming up by either staying in our seats or standing up and moving to get a better look. No one spoke. It was very quiet. We just watched as the plane flew lower and closer to our destination. It didn't look like the other lands that we saw from the jet. Vietnam had all sorts of smoke, both white and black, rising high into the air as far as we could see. Lots of things were burning in a lot of places. Things were definitely going on down there. So, this is it, we thought. We got back into our seats for the landing. We landed. The plane taxied to a certain spot, and the outside door opened. A metal staircase was put against the door on the runway. When the door opened, a heat wave rushed in. As we each got to the door and started down the metal steps, a physical wave of immense heat and smells hit us. I had to hang on to the railing so as not to melt down. The heat carried the smells of Vietnam in that particular spot. It consisted of kerosene jet fuel, burning rice, rotten vegetation, and garbage, all mixed together in a heated, humid vapor as thick as soup. It was difficult to breathe oxygen in that mix, so thick it was. The next thing to notice were the guys leaving Vietnam waiting to get on the same plane once it was refueled as it sat there. No time wasted getting the plane up and out of there. The guys in the waiting line leaving Vietnam were a mix. There were some guys in fairly good shape, with fairly clean jungle fatigues that were smiling, and some saying "your turn newbies" in sort of a mocking way. They were in the minority. Others were skinny and wore shabby, ripped up and dark-stained jungle fatigues, and they had a weird look on their faces. They had eyes that were deeply sunk in their eye sockets, like they had seen things that really shook them up. They looked at us new guys with compassion, sympathy, and understanding that spoke much louder than words. Both groups had to be very happy to get out of Vietnam, but what a difference in how they reacted to us in our dress khaki uniforms. I later found out that the guys who looked fed and had clean jungle uniforms on were the safe back at the base guys. They didn't see combat. The skinny guys with the beat-up uniforms and the faraway look in their eyes were combat. They were the guys who actually fought the war and paid the psychological price for their bravery. Even as new guys getting off the plane, we sort of figured that was the case.
Next stop was the 90th Replacement Battalion on Long Bin Army Base. We got off the bus and were told to stand in a field with our duffel bags. It was hot, hot, hot. One of the guys asked one of the soldiers working there why they called this the 90th Replacement Center. The soldier said that all new guys here were replacing dead and wounded soldiers and soldiers whose one-year tour was over. He added, but mostly dead and wounded lately, because a lot of combat units got hit really bad because of the Tet Offensive. You guys will mostly be infantry, I imagine, assigned to units in the field. Most of their ranks have been cut in half lately. It was March 11th, about 6 weeks after the Tet Offensive. He went on to say that the combat did not die down out in the countryside at all. It was intense, he said. We were happy to get the information from a guy who knows about what's going on here, but we didn't like the sound of the information. Some of the guys were saying that they were trained as cooks or truck drivers and mechanics, but the guy in the know said that didn't matter much what you were trained in, that you would be assigned your duties once you went to the base camp headquarters that you were assigned to. It's the Army way. Next, we exchanged our khakis and regular fatigues and shoes for jungle boots and 2 sets of jungle fatigues and olive drab t-shirts and boxer shorts and socks, and were warned that things are in short supply and that this might be all the clothing that you get for the year. We were then sent to an area with an overhead roof made of tin and told to wait there until our name was called by one of the Army divisions where we would be assigned. We didn't have long to wait. My name with 2 of my buddies' names were called to report to the 25th Infantry Division area. 25th Infantry, oh well. We were then told to wait in an area away from the 90th replacement area where there were tents in a field and to await transportation to Cu Chi Base Camp. The tents had open sides and had a covering only on top. Very open air. We were told by a sergeant to wait there for a helicopter ride to Cu Chi as there were no trucks or any other vehicles, including tanks, able to get through to Cu Chi Base Camp. Cu Chi was the 25th Infantry headquarters and was about 40 miles away from where we were waiting. We asked the sergeant why no road vehicles could get through to Cu Chi, and were told that any convoy that tried to get through was ambushed on the road and that many guys were killed and wounded in the ambushes. Besides, he said, if I were you guys, I wouldn't be in any hurry to get to Cu Chi. People don't last too long at Cu Chi. It's in a very bad area, surrounded by tens of thousands of enemy soldiers, and its perimeter keeps getting overrun at night. And from what I hear, they have only a few helicopters flying, as most were shot down recently or blown up on the airstrip. You may have a long wait here before anyone gets here to take you to Cu Chi.